Hi everyone, this video marks the beginning of my Metroidvania franchise on YouTube, and I wanted to start off by defining Metroidvania. And depending on who you ask, this word can mean different things, but for me it actually has a very specific definition. So before I get into the history of the term and how it deviates from survival horror, I figure I would just sort of lay out what I think the term means. So how do I see the term orthographically? Metroidvania, the term, equals Metroid plus Vania, and those are two different morphemes. So the Metroid morpheme doesn't equal the franchise, Metroid. It's not eponymous necessarily. Rather, the morpheme Metroid equals Metroid, the game's unique treatment of space. And this treatment is recognized by Metroid, the word. And the term is problematically shared between the franchise and a type of world design synonymous with older Metroid games. Part of the problem is that Metroid titles are so infrequent as to be forgotten. They don't get made often enough the way that they were in the past. That old expression, they don't make them like they used to, is incredibly salient when applied to Metroid the franchise because it has evolved into something else.
So what? I guess they just don't make them like they used to, huh? No! Nobody ever made them like this. I mean, the architect was either a certified genius or an authentic wacko.
Those made recently have moved away from what made the franchise so unique to begin with, its treatment of space. The Metroid brand of space, as a result, has had to survive by inserting itself into something else, Vania. Be it Castlevania or Metroidvania, the morpheme Vania simply means other. And yet, Castle, the morpheme in Castlevania, was simply an exhibit of combat with infamous monsters in a fairly straightforward level design. So if I were to say Castle, one, it's a pretty generic term. It's not something that you could say is exclusive to Castlevania, even though it is in the word Castlevania. Castle, but you could say castle and perhaps think of the castle of the Skeksis from the Dark Crystal, or you could think of Mario. Sorry, Mario, your princess is in another castle. Whereas the word Metroid is a bit more unique. When you hear the word Metroid, what do you think of? You think of Metroid. You don't think of Mario. You don't think of Wily's Castle from Mega Man 2, for instance. Metroid in Metroidvania was the insertion into or generation of Metroid-esque space into other games, and not just Castlevania titles, even though those are the most famous. And I'll get into that in just a moment. Survival horror is prolific and canonical, unlike Metroidvania. It originated in 1996 with Resident Evil and has widely been used since then in-game and in writing about games by fans, marketeers, and academics. In short, it was a marketing term and has gained considerable traction over time through official use in a productive franchise and many equally famous offshoots. So with Resident Evil, you've had consecutive releases annually with Resident Evil, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, Nemesis, Resident Evil 4, 5, 6, 7, the remakes of those games. And you also, again, had the offshoots like Dino Crisis, Silent Hill, which were made into movies, mind you. The Silent Hill films, I'm not saying that they were exceptionally good, but that in and of itself is a claim to fame, however dubious that it may be, that Metroid just doesn't have. And then, to add sort of insult to injury, this productivity continues into the present as you move away from games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil from before the year 2000. Once you move into the year 2000 and the following decades, you have games like Dead Space and The Last of Us, which establish their own franchises that sort of build off of survival horror as a term. And while all of this is going on, you have survival horror being used in publication discussing these terms, but also sort of in-game. That famous statement, right? You have once again entered the world of survival horror, gets echoed in titles following Resident Evil. Resident Evil, when it was remade in 2002, changed the statement to enter the survival horror, and with Resident Evil 2 being remade just this year, they had another iteration of that statement as well. So the term survival horror is ubiquitous, it's popular. And Metroid was never nearly as popular as that for a variety of reasons, and by extension, Metroidvania. Metroidvania was never canonical, and it has some pretty inexact origins. You can trace the inception of Metroid-esque space back to 1986, however, the insertion of this kind of space didn't actually occur in other games until 1997 with Symphony of the Night. So until that point, you just had Metroid and Metroid 2 and Super Metroid to sort of define what Metroid space was. And there weren't really other games like it. You know, Mario, Mega Man, Zelda, they had their own iterations of space that weren't the same way. And those three Metroid games sort of were left to define what Metroid space was like, almost exclusively. And it wasn't until Symphony of the Night that they were inserted into a game that wasn't Metroid. And from there, the term is used to describe this phenomena, Metroidvania. It wasn't formally published to anywhere near the same extent as survival horror was. Basically, the moment that survival horror appeared in Resident Evil, it was used as a marketing term. It was used in magazines to talk about this game and other games like it, and the productivity of the term and the games associated with it were gigantic compared to Metroid. Metroid and Metroidvania was basically non-existent. The usage of Metroidvania surfaced slowly over time, long after the games it was being used to describe had been released. So Jeremy Parish cites Scott Sharkey from OneUp.com for having coined the term. And even then, it's pretty inexact, because they say in the early 2000s, give or take. And I have yet to actually speak to Jeremy Parish himself. I would like to maybe see if I can find an exact article. And I'll explain why I even need to do that to begin with just now. It's difficult to find an exact point where the term was formally submitted into publication, except to say that this date seems to come much later than the early 2000s. In that, nowadays you have indie developers that are using the term Metroidvania, like Team Cherry and Hollow Knight. Well, that game was released in 2017, and then Axiom Verge, which was 2015, I believe, where it was very much a Metroidvania kind of experience, and IGN, when they reviewed Axiom Verge, called it just that, Metroidvania. That sense of there being this kind of window where the term started being used, supposedly by Jeremy Parish and Scott Sharkey, but it's almost used exclusively by fans, and it's just kind of on the outskirts. It's in the periphery. It doesn't exist on the body of the marketing world, of the academic world. It just doesn't exist. And there's this weird kind of window where you think it would be used, but isn't, and it's almost like the term has been erased. As far as I can tell, both Jeremy and Scott have voiced their dislike for it, so perhaps this sort of void makes sense. But moreover, Metroidvania's use is discouraged. I've seen that sort of pop up even recently, that it's described as inaccurate, as a lie. But, that being said, as an academic, someone who wishes to study Metroidvania, regardless of how canonical or official it is, it's still a real phenomena. You know, the word was used, and the games that it's being used to describe do in fact exist, and you can trace their lineage backwards. You can go back from Hollow Knight to the Castlevania handhelds of the DS and the Game Boy Advance and the Sony PlayStation with Symphony of the Night, Super Metroid, Metroid 2, and then Metroid. You know, you can trace this lineage backwards, so, and it does exist, and the word, even though it's not nearly as productive and its use is somewhat singular and kind of nebulous, it's definitely something that you can study, and it is being used now to describe Metroidvania as a commodity, if only by indie developers, not by Nintendo themselves. Nintendo has never used the term Metroidvania to describe a Metroid game, whereas someone like Team Cherry almost use it as like a badge of honor. You know, they wear it on their sleeve that they're making a Metroidvania game, and they're getting a certain amount of attention, but it's only years later that Metroidvania is starting to gain traction, whereas survival horror, Resident Evil, games like that, and their treatment of space has had traction from day one. And I'm much more interested in Metroid and Metroidvania because Metroid's treatment of space, which has been sort of described retroactively by Metroidvania, that's what I'm interested in, the Gothic castle, that sort of phenomena, which really hasn't been reified by Resident Evil or similar franchises. Like, their treatment of space is much less open-ended. It's much more labyrinthine and much less maze-like, and you can't really describe the type of space that I want to get into without using Metroid or Metroidvania. And when people hear Vania and Metroid, they think, okay, Castlevania. No. It's just Vania by itself. The same Vania that was attached to Castle to create Castlevania was attached afterwards to Metroid. And Metroid is the star component of that. Even though the most famous examples of Metroidvania are non-Metroid games, that's just par for the course. It had to insert itself into non-Metroid games to preserve itself as a form of space in video games, because it just doesn't get made that often, not to the same extent as the first-person shooter or Mario, the Mario-esque platformer. I mean, there are so many Mario games that get made, so many Zelda games that get made, and just because those games are getting made and they're much more prolific and productive doesn't mean that you should take what should be called Metroid and instead call it Mario or Zelda. That's inaccurate. And it's actually better, in my opinion, to call something Metroid if the space functions in a way that is like Metroid, you know, open-ended, grid-like, non-linear. But there's a specific way that that goes about, and I'll talk about that in my next video. If you like the video, like, share, and subscribe it. It lets me know that people are interested, they like hearing what I have to say, and I certainly want to raise awareness about Metroidvania in the future, and that's kind of the point of this series of mine, is to, you know, talk about this historically. Anyways, guys, until my next video, I hope you like this one, and until then, stay tuned for more content. Cheers.